3 days before that kitchen fell silent, Mabel Harper stepped down from a freight wagon outside Peabody's general store with a carpetbag in one hand, a sack of flour tucked against her hip, and the kind of tired smile a woman wears when she knows the world is already laughing before she has spoken. The street was dry that afternoon, the wind carrying dust along the boards and rattling the signs above the store fronts. Laramie was not large enough for strangers to arrive unnoticed, and Mabel was not the sort of woman people let pass without measuring. She felt the looks before she heard the whispers. Women paused with baskets on their arms. A ranch hand leaned against a hitching post and smirked into his coffee. 2 girls near the mercantile window covered their mouths, not well enough to hide the giggle. Mabel kept her chin level. She had learned long ago that looking down only gave cruel people permission to lean closer. The driver, Amos Bell, climbed from the wagon seat and tossed her carpetbag onto the boardwalk harder than he needed to. "Whitmore Ranch is still 8 miles out," he said. "Road turns rough after Miller Creek." "I can walk if you are done hauling me," Mabel answered. Amos looked her up and down, not with kindness and not quite with pity. "You carrying flour in a bag, Miss Harper? You will ride." The general store door opened, and Mrs. Peabody stepped out wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes went first to the flour, then to Mabel's dress, then to the soft roundness of Mabel's face and waist, as if every inch of her were something to be judged and priced. "You are the new cook?" she asked. Mabel held out the folded letter of reference. "I am here to try for the position." Mrs. Peabody did not take the letter. "Caleb Whitmore does not keep help long." "Then I suppose I should make a good supper." A small laugh passed through the women nearby. One of them, thin as a broom handle and twice as sharp, said, "Supper will not save you from those boys." Mabel turned toward her. "What boys?" Amos muttered. "The twins." Mrs. Peabody's mouth tightened with the pleasure of having bad news to share. "Noah and Eli Whitmore. 7 years old. Lost their mother last year. Since then they have chased off every woman who crossed that threshold. One cook left before breakfast. Another cried all the way back to town. The last one said the quiet boy stared at her like she had stolen something from the dead." Mabel's fingers tightened around the letter, but her voice stayed even. "Children in grief are not thieves." The broom-thin woman snorted. "Listen to her. 3 minutes in town and she knows better than all of us." Amos lifted the flour sack from Mabel's arms and set it in the wagon. "Do not mind them." Mabel looked at the dusty road stretching west, toward low hills and a ranch she had never seen. "I have minded worse." He climbed back onto the seat. "There is something else you ought to know. Caleb Whitmore is not looking for a wife, no matter what folks say. He wants meals cooked, floors swept, boys kept fed, and no woman putting flowers on his wife's grave or softness in his house." Mabel settled beside the flour, smoothing her skirt over her knees. The word wife touched an old bruise inside her, one nobody on that street could see. Once, in another town, she had stood outside a church with her best gloves on while a man decided she was too much woman to marry and not enough woman to choose. Since then, she had carried herself like a door half closed. "I am not going there to be loved," she said. "I am going there to work." Amos clicked his tongue to the horses, and the wagon rolled forward. Behind them, Mrs. Peabody called out, "Do not unpack too much, Miss Harper. You will be back before Sunday." Mabel did not turn. She watched Laramie shrink behind her, boardwalks and staring faces fading into dust. Ahead, the road widened into open country, 8 miles of wind, sagebrush, and fence line leading toward a house that did not want her. She rested one hand on the sack of flour and whispered, not to Amos, not to the town, but to herself, "I do not need them to love me. I just need them to let me stay long enough to prove I can be useful." By the time Amos Bell turned the wagon off the main road, the sun had dropped behind the low Wyoming hills and the Whitmore Ranch appeared in the distance like a place that had forgotten how to welcome anyone. The house was not poor. Mabel could see that at once. The fences were mended, the barn roof was sound, and the corral gate hung straight on its hinges. But there was no flower box under the window, no wash snapping on the line, no curtain pulled back by curious hands. Even the porch looked stiff, as if nobody had sat there for pleasure in a very long while. Amos slowed the horses near the steps and cleared his throat. "This is as far as I go. Mabel climbed down before he could offer a hand, not because she was proud, but because she had learned that help given in public often came with a price. She lifted her carpet bag, took the flower, and stood at the foot of the porch while Amos drove away in a rattle of wheels and dust. For a few breaths nothing moved. Then the front door opened. Caleb Whitmore stood there in a work shirt faded by sun, his sleeves rolled to the forearms, his face lean and still beneath a dark hat. He was a white man, tall and weathered, with the kind of eyes that did not ask questions twice and did not look long at anything that might ask something from him. His gaze passed over Mabel's bonnet, her round cheeks, her full figure, the sack of flour in her arms, and the letter pinned carefully beneath her gloved thumb. Not cruel, she thought. Worse. Deciding. Miss Harper? He asked. Yes, sir. You are late. The creek road was washed out near the bend. Road is always washed out somewhere. She swallowed. I came as quick as I could. He stepped back from the door, not quite inviting her in, only making space for her to enter. The house smelled of cold ashes, old coffee, and rooms kept too quiet. Mabel crossed the threshold and saw a parlor where no lamp had been lit though dusk had already gathered in the corners. A woman's rocking chair sat near the window with a folded quilt over one arm. No dust touched it. Nothing touched it. Caleb caught her looking. You will not sit there. Mabel lowered her eyes. I understand. Kitchen is through there. Your room is off the pantry. You get 3 days. 3 days. Trial only. You cook breakfast by 5:30, dinner at noon if the hands are near enough, supper before dark. You do not ask about my wife. You do not move her things. You do not take my boys into town. You do not make promises to them. His voice had no anger in it, which made every word land harder. I was hired to cook, Mr. Whitmore. You were hired to cook. Nothing more. A sound came from the staircase. Mabel turned and saw 2 boys watching through the railings. They were alike in face but not in spirit. Noah stood in front, brown hair wild, chin lifted like a challenge. Eli stood half behind him, pale fingers curled around the banister, eyes too large for his thin face. Mabel gave them a gentle nod. Good evening. Noah reached to the small table beside him, picked up a tin cup, and let it fall to the floor with a sharp clatter. Eli flinched but did not speak. Caleb's mouth tightened. Noah. The boy stared at Mabel. She will leave. Mabel set the flour on the kitchen table. Maybe. But not before breakfast. Noah frowned, as if she had answered the wrong question in a language he did not trust. The last one cried. I am sorry she was sad. I put salt in her sugar jar. That would trouble a cake. Caleb stepped forward. Enough. But Mabel only removed her gloves, folded them neatly, and walked into the kitchen. The room was large, built for a family that had once expected many mornings together, but the stove was gray with neglect, the basin held 2 bowls crusted from an old meal, and a streak of flour lay hardened along the counter like a memory of work abandoned halfway through. Mabel looked at the cold stove, the boys on the stairs, and Caleb waiting for her to fail. Then she tied on her plain apron and reached for the coal bucket. Mr. Whitmore, she said softly, where do you keep the kindling? Caleb did not answer right away. His eyes shifted to the stove, then to the boys, then back to the woman who had not asked to be liked before beginning. Box by the back door, he said. Mabel nodded. Noah whispered something to Eli, but Eli's gaze had fixed on her hands as she knelt and opened the stove. The house remained cold, but the first small scratch of a match sounded through the kitchen like a promise nobody had given permission to make. Mabel had cooked in boarding houses, church basements, railway kitchens, and one back room behind a dry goods store where the stove smoked so badly her eyes watered until noon, but the Whitmore kitchen tested her before the first pan ever touched the fire. The flour bin had been left open. The lard crock was nearly empty. A sack of potatoes sat sprouting in the corner, and the coffee tin held more dust than grounds. She did not complain. Complaining filled no stomachs. She rolled up her sleeves, scrubbed the table, set water to heat, and worked while Caleb stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his face unreadable. Noah hovered near the stairs, waiting for his chance. Eli sat halfway up, knees drawn to his chest, silent as a little shadow. You forgot the salt, Noah said when Mabel began mixing biscuit dough. I have not reached for it yet. The other cook forgot. Then I hope she found it later. Noah narrowed his eyes. You talk funny. I talk hungry. There is a difference. That almost caught him. His mouth twitched, but he buried it fast. Mabel turned her back just long enough to reach for the milk, and behind her came the soft scrape of a chair. She looked over her shoulder and saw Noah standing beside the work table with the salt cellar in his hand, his chin lifted in open challenge. Caleb pushed away from the door. Noah, put that down. Mabel raised one hand without looking at Caleb. Let him. Caleb stilled. Noah's eyes flicked between them. You said I could. I said let him, Mabel replied. I did not say I would use what he spoiled. Noah tipped the salt into the small bowl of dough with the grim determination of a boy trying to prove the world would always leave him first. White crystals scattered across the flour. The room held its breath. Mabel lifted the bowl, carried it to the scrap pail, and emptied it without a word. Then she rinsed the bowl, dried it, and began again. Noah stared. You are not mad? I am hungry. Anger takes too long. I ruined it. You ruined one bowl. We have another. Eli leaned forward on the stair. Mabel saw him from the corner of her eye, saw the thin fingers tighten around the railing, saw interest stir where fear had been. She measured flour again, cut in the last of the lard and mixed carefully. The stove warmed at her back. Soon the kitchen began to change. It was not grand, not magical, not sudden, but the smell came first, soft and buttery, slipping under doors and around grief. Potatoes simmered with onion. A small pot of gravy thickened on the stove. Biscuits rose golden in the oven, their tops brushed with the little milk she had saved. Noah pretended not to care. Caleb pretended not to watch. Eli slid down one step, then another. When supper was ready, Mabel did not call them sweetly or make a show of kindness. She set 3 plates at the table and one smaller bowl beneath the side bench where Eli had tucked himself halfway out of sight. Caleb noticed. Miss Harper. Some children eat better when no one is staring at them. My son eats at the table. Then he will, when he is ready. Noah dropped into a chair as if doing so were an act of war. Caleb remained standing. Mabel served stew, biscuits, and gravy, then stepped back toward the stove as though her own hunger could wait. Noah took one bite, prepared to hate it, and forgot his speech. His spoon went back into the bowl. Then again. Under the bench, Eli's small hand appeared, took the biscuit, and vanished. Mabel kept her eyes on the stove. Caleb saw everything. He saw crumbs fall near Eli's shoes. He saw Noah slow down, not because he disliked the food, but because he wanted it to last. He saw the shape of the kitchen soften around a woman nobody in Laramie had expected to last until dark. After a while, Eli's voice came from beneath the bench, so quiet it might have been the floorboards speaking. Mama made biscuits. Noah stopped eating. Caleb's hand tightened around the back of a chair. Mabel turned just enough to see Eli peeking out, biscuit held in both hands, his eyes wet but calm. She did not step toward him. She did not say his mother was gone. She did not try to fill a place that was holy with loss. She only nodded once and said, then she must have known how to make a house smell kind. Caleb looked away toward the dark window, but not before Mabel saw his throat move. That night, long after the dishes were washed and the boys had been sent upstairs, Caleb came down for water and paused at the foot of the stairs. No crying came from the room above. No pacing, no small broken sounds, no Noah whispering comfort he was too young to carry. Only sleep. Real sleep. Caleb stood there in his stocking feet, one hand on the banister, listening to the quiet as if it were a language he had forgotten. In the kitchen, Mabel banked the fire for morning, folded her apron over the chair, and pretended not to notice that the lonely cowboy did not look so certain anymore. The second night at Whitmore Ranch brought a wind that pressed against the windows like a hand searching for a way in, and near midnight Mabel woke to the sound of bare feet running past the pantry room. She sat up before she was fully awake. The house was dark except for a weak line of lamplight trembling beneath the boy's door. Then Noah's voice came from the hall, thin with fear. Pa, he is hot again. Mabel reached for her shawl and stepped out just as Caleb came up the stairs 2 at a time with a lamp in one hand. His face was hard, but the flame shook because his hand did. Go back to bed, Miss Harper, he said. This is not kitchen work. She looked past him into the room where Eli lay curled beneath a quilt, cheeks flushed, hair damp at his temples, one small hand pushing weakly at the blanket as if even cloth felt too heavy. Noah stood beside the bed in his nightshirt, trying to look brave and failing. Mabel did not argue with Caleb. She simply moved around him, touched Eli's forehead with the back of her fingers, then turned toward the washstand. He needs cool cloths. Not cold. Cool. And water if he will take it. Caleb stood in the doorway. I know how to care for my son. I believe you. She wrung out a cloth and laid it gently across Eli's brow. But tonight you do not have to do it alone. The words landed in the room without asking permission. Caleb looked at her as if she had set something dangerous on the floor between them. For a long moment, he seemed ready to send her away from the bed, from the room, from the need in his own house. Then Eli turned his face toward her hand and quieted. That was all it took. Caleb stepped back. Mabel worked without fuss. She changed the cloth, lifted Eli just enough for him to sip water, and spoke to him in a low voice about simple things. Warm biscuits in the morning, a brown mare she had once known, a creak in spring that sounded like spoons in a wash basin. Noah sat at the foot of the bed hugging his knees. Is he going to get worse? He asked. Mabel looked at him directly. Children knew when grown people lied. He is going to have a long night. So are we. But fever is not always a bad visitor. Sometimes it comes in loud and leaves before dawn. Noah swallowed. Mama used to sing when he was sick. The room changed around the word. Caleb looked toward the window. Mabel folded the cloth again, buying herself a breath. What did she sing? Noah shook his head. I cannot remember all of it. Eli moved restlessly, his small fingers searching the quilt. Mabel began softly, not the song their mother had sung, but one her own mother carried from Kentucky, a slow little tune about moonlight on a river and home waiting beyond the hill. Her voice was not pretty in the way church women liked voices to be pretty. It was warm, worn, and steady like bread wrapped in a towel. Noah leaned against the bedpost. Eli's breathing eased. Caleb remained outside the doorway, half in shadow, one shoulder against the frame, watching a woman he had hired for meals sit beside his child as though a sick boy at midnight was exactly where she belonged. Near 3 in the morning, Noah fell asleep in the chair. Caleb came in then, silent in his stocking feet, and reached to carry him back to bed. Mabel lifted a finger to her lips, and for once the rancher obeyed without a word. When Caleb bent over Eli, the boy stirred and caught Mabel's hand instead of his father's. The gesture was small, but Caleb saw it. His face did not change yet. Something in his eyes lowered like a gate no longer holding. You should rest, he said quietly. So should you. I have rested enough in empty rooms. Mabel looked up at him then, and neither of them looked away quickly enough. By dawn the fever had broken. Pale light slid across the floorboards. Eli opened his eyes, found Mabel still sitting there, and curled his fingers tighter around hers. His voice came rough from sleep, barely more than a whisper, but clear enough to make Caleb stop at the foot of the bed. Do not go. Mabel's throat tightened. Caleb looked from his son's hand to hers, then turned toward the window as if the morning light had become too bright to bear. By the morning after Eli's fever broke, the Whitmore kitchen had changed in ways too small for a stranger to name and too large for Caleb to ignore. The stove was lit before sunrise, not smoking and angry the way it usually did, but steady and bright. Coffee steamed in the pot. A clean towel hung beside the basin. The table had been scrubbed until the old knife marks showed pale in the wood, and the little chairs had been pulled close enough that the boys no longer looked like guests in their own house. Mabel moved through it all with quiet purpose, her sleeves rolled, her cheeks warm from the fire, flour dusting one side of her apron. She did not sing that morning. She did not have to. The house seemed to hum around her anyway. Noah came downstairs first, hair sticking up, suspicion still trying to hold its place on his face. He found Mabel cutting biscuit dough with the rim of a tin cup. You are doing it wrong, he said. Most likely. Mama used a glass. Then your mama was fancier than I am. Noah studied her, waiting for the sadness to turn sharp. It did not. Mabel set the tin cup in his hand. You want to try? He looked toward the doorway, where Caleb stood with his hat in one hand, ready to say no before the invitation settled. But Noah had already pressed the cup into the dough. The circle came out crooked. For half a second, he looked ready to be ashamed. Mabel leaned over it with solemn care. That one has character. Noah blinked. Then to Caleb's. Surprised, the boy laughed. It was not loud. It was not long. But it crossed the kitchen like a match struck in a dark room. Caleb's fingers tightened around his hat. He had not heard that sound in months without it breaking apart at the end. Eli came next, wrapped in a quilt, pale but steady on his feet. He went straight to Mabel and stood beside her, not asking for anything, only choosing the place nearest her skirt. Mabel did not make a fuss. She gave him a small pinch of dough and let him roll it between his palms. That one is for you, she said. Eli nodded, serious as a banker. Caleb watched from the threshold. He should have stepped inside. It was his house. His table. His son's. But the warmth coming from that kitchen frightened him more than any empty room ever had. Empty rooms asked nothing. Warm rooms asked a man to believe he might lose something again. His eyes moved to the parlor beyond the hall, where Sarah's rocking chair sat near the window, quilt folded on the arm, exactly where he had left it after the service. He had kept that chair untouched as proof that he remembered. Now he wondered if memory had become a locked door his children were trapped behind. Mabel turned and found him looking. She did not follow his gaze. She did not speak his wife's name. She only set a plate near the stove and said, "Breakfast is ready when you are." Caleb nodded but did not move. Later that afternoon, when the hands were out repairing fence and Mabel was washing flour from Eli's fingers, Caleb came in carrying a split piece of kindling. He had meant to leave it by the stove and go. Instead, he stopped when he heard Noah whisper from beneath the table, where the twins were building a fort with 2 chairs and an old feed sack. Maybe God sent her because Mama could not come back. Eli answered so softly Caleb almost missed it. Maybe Mama asked him to. The kindling slipped in Caleb's hand and knocked against the floor. Both boys went silent. Mabel looked up from the basin, her face still, her hands wet. Caleb could have corrected them. He could have said no one was sent, no one was staying, no woman belonged in the space. Grief had carved out. But Noah's words remained in the air, and Eli's small hope sat beside them like a candle neither child dared touch. Caleb bent, picked up the kindling, and placed it carefully by the stove. "Supper smells good," he said, though supper was barely started. Mabel lowered her eyes, but he saw her hand pause on the towel. That evening, he sat at the table for the whole meal. He did not say much. Caleb Whitmore had never been a man of many words. But when Eli passed him the butter without being asked, and Noah slid the least burnt biscuit onto Mabel's plate because he claimed she had earned it, Caleb stayed. He stayed through the meal, through the washing of dishes, through the soft scrape of chairs being pushed back into place. And when Mabel reached for her folded apron at the end of the night, Caleb saw her glance toward the pantry room, toward the small space that still held her unpacked bag. The trial was ending soon. 3 days, he had said. Only 3 days. But the house no longer sounded the way it had sounded before she came, and that was the trouble. Caleb had learned how to survive silence. He did not know if he was strong enough to survive hope. On the 3rd afternoon, when the trial was nearly over and the ranch had begun to smell of yeast, coffee, and cleanwood smoke, a rider came up the west road with a letter tucked under the band of his hat. Mabel saw him first through the kitchen window. She was teaching Eli how to press thumbprints into a row of small jam cookies, while Noah stood on a chair beside her insisting his were better because they leaned to one side like tired cowboys. Caleb had gone to the barn to check a lame mare, and for a few golden minutes the house felt almost ordinary. Then the rider stopped near the porch and ordinary vanished. Mabel recognized the horse before she recognized the man. It belonged to Peabody's stable in Laramie. Her hands went still in the flour. Noah noticed. "Is he bringing sugar?" Mabel wiped her fingers on her apron. "No, sweetheart. I expect he is bringing trouble." The rider knocked once and opened the door before anyone invited him in. He was young, freckled, and embarrassed enough to look at the floor, but not embarrassed enough to turn back. "Miss Harper?" he asked. "That is me." He held out a folded paper. "Mrs. Peabody said this came after you left town. She figured Mr. Whitmore ought to see it before making any lasting arrangement." Mabel did not take the letter fast enough. Noah stepped down from the chair. Why would Pa need to see her letter? The writer shifted his hat in his hands. Not my business. Then why are you in our kitchen? Noah asked. Mabel reached for the paper before the boy could say more. Thank you. You can go. But Caleb had already come in from the back, his boots quiet on the boards, his eyes moving from the writer to Mabel's face. What is it? Nothing that needs your time. The writer swallowed. Sir, Mrs. Peabody said it was from Mr. Russell Vane. The name changed the room. Not because Caleb knew it but because Mabel did. Her face lost color, and the folded paper bent slightly in her fingers. Caleb took one step closer. Who is Russell Vane? Mabel forced a small smile. A man from a life I do not carry anymore. Looks like he found a way to carry it here. The writer backed toward the door. I will be going. No one stopped him. The wagon road swallowed the sound of his horse, and still Mabel stood with the letter in her hand as if it had weight enough to pull her through the floor. Caleb held out his palm. May I? I would rather burn it. Then burn it. That kindness nearly undid her. She looked at the boys, at Eli's flour-dusted fingers, at Noah's sharp worried stare, and something old and ashamed rose in her throat. No. You should know what kind of woman your town thinks you have under your roof. She opened the letter herself. Her eyes moved over the page once, then stopped. Caleb saw the tremble in her mouth before she folded it again. Read it, he said quietly. Please do not ask that. Noah stepped closer to her skirt. Did he say something mean? Mabel put one hand on his shoulder. Some people do when they cannot bear being forgotten. Caleb took the letter then, not roughly, not by force, only because her fingers had loosened as if they could no longer. Hold it. He read in silence. Russell Vane's words were neat, polished, and cruel in the tidy way of men who believed paper could do what their courage could not. He wrote that Mabel Harper had once stood at a church door in a blue dress and waited for a groom who had chosen not to come. He wrote that no respectable man wanted a woman of her size unless he needed free labor and a warm stove. He wrote that Caleb Whitmore should save himself the embarrassment before Laramie made a joke of his dead wife's house. When Caleb finished, he did not speak. He crossed to the stove, opened the iron door, and fed the letter into the fire. Mabel watched the edges curl black. Burning it does not make it untrue, she whispered. Caleb turned. It was never true because it was written. You do not understand. People like Mrs. Peabody will talk. Your boys will hear things. Your hands will hear things. I came here for work, not to drag shame across your porch. My porch has stood through worse than gossip. But your wife's memory should not have to. That was the sentence that found him. Caleb looked toward the parlor, toward the chair by the window, toward the shape of a past he had guarded so fiercely he had mistaken guarding for love. Mabel untied her apron with careful fingers. The 3 days are nearly done. I will leave before breakfast. It will be easier if the boys wake after I am gone. Mabel. It was the first time he had used her given name. She closed her eyes for one breath, then opened them with her face steady. Please do not make me ask to stay where I am already becoming a problem. Caleb could have stopped her then. One word would have done it. But fear rose faster than courage. Fear of town talk, fear of the boys hoping too much, fear of Sarah's chair looking less like a shrine and more like a prison. So he looked at the stove instead of at Mabel and said the smallest, coldest thing he had said since she arrived. The wagon leaves at dawn. Behind the pantry door, where the twins had slipped unnoticed after the letter burned, Noah put both hands over Eli's mouth before the younger boy could cry out. Mabel folded her apron, placed it on the table beside the cooling cookies, and walked toward her little room to pack. By dusk, Mabel's carpetbag sat packed beside the pantry door, and the Whitmore kitchen looked too clean for leaving. She had washed every bowl, covered the leftover stew, wrapped the jam cookies in a towel, and placed the flour tin where Noah could reach it if anyone ever let him try again. The apron she had worn for 3 days lay folded on the table, plain and white and empty. Mabel stood beside it with both hands resting on the wood, breathing slowly through the ache in her chest. She had left places before. She knew how to make her feet move when her heart wanted to stay behind. What she did not know was how to walk away from 2 little boys who had begun to look for her in every room. Caleb stood in the doorway between the hall and the kitchen, The same place he had stood when she first came in, only now the stove was warm behind her and the house no longer felt like it was holding its breath. "You will have your pay before morning," he said. Mabel nodded. "Thank you. Amos Bell can take you as far as town." "That will be fine." Neither of them moved. The words between them were neat and proper, but everything in the room had turned unsteady. Caleb's eyes went to the folded apron, then to the covered cookies, then to the little chair Eli had dragged beside Mabel's place at supper. His hand gripped the doorframe as if the wood were the only thing keeping him from stepping forward. Mabel picked up her bag. "Good night, Mr. Whitmore." That was when Noah burst from the hall. His hair was wild, his face streaked with tears he had tried and failed to hide. Eli came behind him, smaller, silent, clutching the corner of his nightshirt in one fist. "No," Noah said. Caleb turned sharply. "Noah, go upstairs." "No," the boy ran to Mabel and wrapped both arms around her waist. "You cannot make her leave just because people talked." Mabel's hand hovered above his hair, afraid to touch him and make it worse. "Noah, she did not do anything wrong." His voice cracked. "She stayed when I was mean. She made Eli better. She taught me biscuits can be crooked. She does not make the house sad." Caleb's face went still. "Son." "No," Noah shook his head hard, pressing closer to Mabel's skirt. "You always say a man protects his home. Well, she is in our home." Eli had not moved. He stood 3 feet away, eyes lifted to his father, his small chest rising and falling fast. Caleb looked at him and the room waited. Eli stepped forward, one slow step, then another until he reached Mabel's side. He took her hand in both of his. His fingers were warm and trembling. "Papa," he said. Caleb seemed to forget how to breathe. Eli swallowed and tried again, stronger this time. "Let her stay with us." Mabel closed her eyes. The fire gave a soft pop in the stove. Noah cried openly now, not with shame, but with all the grief a child had carried too long. "She did not try to be Mama," he said. "She just stayed when we were bad." Caleb looked toward the parlor, toward Sarah's chair, toward the untouched quilt that had ruled the house like a quiet commandment. Then he looked back at his sons clinging to a woman who had asked for nothing but work and had given them back supper, sleep, laughter, and hope. His hand slipped from the doorway. He stepped into the kitchen. One step, then another. Mabel opened her eyes as Caleb reached for the carpet bag. For a terrible second, she thought he meant to carry it to the porch himself. Instead, he took it from her hand and set it back beside the pantry door. "She stays," he said. Noah went silent. Eli held Mabel's hand tighter. Caleb's voice dropped lower, but every word filled the kitchen. "And any man or woman who says she does not belong under this roof can say it to me first." Mabel stared at him, unable to speak. Caleb looked at her then, not past her, not through her, but at her as if he was finally seeing the woman who had warmed his house without asking to own it. "Miss Harper," he said, rough and quiet, "I was wrong to make fear sound like sense." Mabel's mouth trembled. "And tomorrow?" Caleb glanced at the stove, the table, the boys, and the apron waiting to be worn again. "Tomorrow," he said, "you cook breakfast here." Morning came soft over Whitmore Ranch, pale gold across the pasture and silver on the water troughs, and for the first time in nearly a year Caleb did not wake to a house that sounded empty. He woke to the thump of little feet on the stairs, the scrape of a chair across the kitchen boards, and Mabel Harper's voice telling Noah that too much flour on a biscuit was not courage, it was weather. Caleb stood outside the kitchen for a moment with his shirt sleeves unbuttoned, and his hair still damp from the wash basin, listening. Eli laughed first. Then Noah. The sound moved through the hall, past Sarah's quiet chair, and something in Caleb's chest loosened without asking his permission. When he stepped into the kitchen, Mabel looked up from the table with flour on her cheek and surprise in her eyes, as if part of her still expected to be sent away each time he crossed a doorway. Caleb reached for the coffee pot himself. "Morning, Miss Harper." Noah grinned. "She burned one." Mabel lifted her chin. "A little brown is not burned." Eli held up a biscuit shaped like a bent horseshoe. "This one is Papa's." Caleb accepted it as solemnly as if the boy had handed him a deed to half the county. "Best one here." That settled something. Not everything. Healing did not arrive like thunder. It came like bread rising slow and warm beneath a towel. After breakfast, Caleb hitched the wagon and told Mabel they were going into Laramie for sugar, coffee, and a bolt of cloth for kitchen curtains. Mabel paused with her hand on the pantry shelf. I can write a list. You can come. Her eyes flicked toward the boys. Noah already had his boots on. Eli stood beside him, holding Mabel's folded shawl. The ride into town was 8 miles, and every mile taught Caleb the shape of his own choice. Mabel sat beside the boys, not speaking much, one hand steady on the seat when the wagon jolted over ruts. At Peabody's general store, the bell above the door rang, and every head turned. Mrs. Peabody's mouth went thin. The broom-shaped woman near the Cracker Barrel whispered loud enough for Shelves to hear. Well, mercy, he brought her back. Mabel's shoulders stiffened, but she kept walking. Noah took her left hand. Eli took her right. Caleb saw the whole room notice. He let them. Mrs. Peabody came around the counter. Mr. Whitmore, I hope you received the warning in time. Caleb set his hat on the counter. The store went quiet. I did. Then I suppose you have made arrangements. I have. Mrs. Peabody glanced at Mabel with a smile too small to be kind. A woman in her position can be difficult to place. Caleb's eyes sharpened, but his voice stayed low. Her position is at my table. No one moved. Outside, a horse stamped at the hitching rail. Caleb looked around the store, at the faces that had laughed before knowing her, at the mouths waiting for permission to be cruel. Miss Harper is under my roof. She cooks in my kitchen. My boys asked her to stay and so did I. Any concern about that can be brought to me, not carried behind her back. Mrs. Peabody's face colored. The broom-shaped woman found sudden interest in a sack of beans. Noah stood taller. Eli pressed closer to Mabel, but he did not hide. Mabel did not smile. Not yet. She only breathed, as if the air in that store had finally become hers to take. Caleb picked up the sugar, coffee, and blue calico for curtains, paid full price, and held the door open while Mabel and the boys walked out ahead of him. By winter, the Whitmore house had changed so completely that strangers might have believed it had always been warm. Blue curtains hung at the kitchen windows. Sarah's quilt no longer sat untouched in the parlor. Mabel had folded it over the back of the rocker, where Eli sometimes curled beneath it after supper. Noah learned to cut biscuits nearly round. Eli spoke more each week, small words at first, then whole thoughts that made Caleb turn away when his eyes grew bright. And Mabel, still soft in the middle,